coffee consumers and crime connoisseurs. Welcome to the 16th episode of Mugshot Mornings, where we explore true crime one sip at a time. Now, today's video is going to be, oh my god, happy Halloween! Happy Halloween, one of my favorite holidays. I think it's between Christmas and Halloween to be like my top favorite holiday. Sorry, words are hard. So today we have to discuss a cult. We have to discuss something really creepy on Halloween, of course. So we'll be discussing a cult today that you've probably never heard of. Today we're going to travel back to 1991 in Johnson, Indiana, a town engulfed in the distress of the Satanic Panic. Today, we're going to explore how teenage rebellion spiraled into a chilling murder that shocked the community. Mark Goodwin, a young man deeply drawn into Satanism, led a group of friends down a path of darkness, culminating in a horrific initiation ritual that would change their lives forever. Now, today I did have to base a lot of today's script off of different podcasts and YouTube videos that I had watched. Even whenever I went to Google to type in the men's names or the Carny cult, as you can see in the title of the video, or they're also known as Satan's disciples, which again, I don't want to give too much. We'll talk about that in a second. It only showed links to podcasts and videos, so no articles. I went down a rabbit hole. And I did find one article, and that was already, I'm assuming, one of the articles that this podcast based it off of too. So, long intro for literally no reason. What are we sipping on today? I made a caramel, I think I just made a caramel latte. Just plain caramel, because I didn't want to drive anywhere today. It's also like 9 a.m. and I'm still trying to wake up because I got up pretty early so that I could go to work later. It's good. It's good. So tell me, if y'all are sipping on something, let me know. I feel like I always tell you what I'm sipping on. No one ever tells me what they're sipping on. So yeah, I think I made a caramel latte with oat milk, iced, because hot is for losers. How long have I been talking? A while. Got it. Got it. Yeah. So let's get into our sip and solve for today, the new segment. I'm actually going to talk about last week's sip and solve because my sister made a really good point. My sister, for the last week's sip and solve, we talked about D.B. Cooper and how he had ransom money on this flight and jumped out of a parachute and hit the ground and was never seen again. Bits and pieces of the ransom money was found, but she made a good point that it is very possible that he jumped out and landed like either like in the ocean or the forest and just like couldn't survive. He probably didn't know how to survive in the forest. So, and also you're jumping out into the forest with all this money. He's probably did survive the crash, but he did not survive the days after. So I think that was a really good theory. I don't think that he ever used the ransom money. I do believe that he probably did die. I don't know why I was laughing when I said that. I'm so sorry. That was kind of sinister. Okay, let's get into today's new sip and solve, and then y'all can tell me y'all's thoughts and theories down below for this week's segment. In the small town of Circleville, Ohio, during the late 1970s, residents began receiving anonymous threatening letters. These letters contained personal details about the recipients' lives, secrets that only someone close to them could know. The letters targeted a variety of individuals, but one family in particular became the focus: the Gillespies. In 1977, Mary Gillespie, a school bus driver, received a letter accusing her of having an affair with the local school superintendent. The anonymous writer demanded she end the affair or dire consequences would follow. The letters continued for years, leading to a string of bizarre and tragic events. Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, received a phone call one night, rushed out of the house, and was later found dead in the crashed truck. Many believed he was shot before the crash, although authorities ruled his death as an accident. The mystery went on when Mary's brother-in-law, Paul Freshour, was convicted of sending the letters after a booby trap meant for Mary was found and traced back to him. But even while Paul was in prison, the letters continued to arrive, fueling speculation that the real culprit was still out there. To this day, the identity of the Circleville letter writer remains unknown. So, do we believe that it was her brother? Do we believe that it was someone else? Do you believe it was like the brother and someone else? So again, as always, Sip and Solve is something that y'all have to do kind of on your own. It's kind of like a little homework, because if I talk about the entire segment, it's going to be the entire video, and this video is going to be really long. So I give a pretty shortened version of Sip and Solve. So go do your homework, let me know your thoughts and theories, and then I will tell my favorite one next week whenever I introduce a new Sip and Solve segment. Okay, let's get into the story of today's cult, everyone. Very, very, very insane. Again, this is going to be kind of a short one because there's not a lot of information out there. There isn't even a lot of pictures out there. So I'm going to have to, you're kind of going to have to see my face the whole time. So sorry. So it's 1991 in Johnson, Indiana, a small town that suddenly found itself wrapped up in the Satanic Panic that was sweeping the U.S. Graffiti was popping up all over town with tags like COS and upside down pentagrams. For those of you who don't know, COS actually stands for Church of Satan. At first, police brushed it off like this is just teens being teens, testing the limits, but then things started getting really strange. In the 1980s, Mark Goodwin was in middle school at Custer Baker Middle School in Indiana. He was given a simple assignment to write about Halloween. He was only about 12 years old at the time, which is pretty early to start dabbling in really dark books and things like that. Things that no 12-year-old should really be getting into. While most kids probably wrote about candy and costumes, Mark's paper went into a whole other direction. He went to the library, digging up anything he could find about Satanism. And from there, things changed. He listened to Ozzy Osbourne's Diary of a Madman album, but this was problematic and controversial at the time. Ozzy was pretty scrutinized for his dark lyrics around the time of the Satanic Panic, and many people believed that he had a direct influence on young people who wanted to involve themselves in Satanism. He was a firm believer that music, movies, or video games do not cause people to commit violent acts, and his lyrics were never intended to cause any harm. By high school, Mark had formed his own group called Satan's Disciples. It was a small group that consisted of different friends or friends of friends who joined him in pledging loyalty to Satan. The ages ranged from 12 to 35, which is kind of like, how did you even find someone 35 whenever Mark was, in high school? How did you get this age range? At first, they would get together, hang out, read from the Satanic Bible, and occasionally wander around cemeteries. For Mark, though, it became more than just a way to hang out. He was dead serious about Satanism. While his friends might drink or smoke, he would stay sober, fully committed to his master and his leader. He even bought a black robe that he would wear to their meetings. Before long, he decided the group needed to prove its dedication to Satan. At first, this began with animal sacrifices. They would drain the blood of the animals and drink from a goblet while dancing around a makeshift altar, acting like they had been possessed. The whole thing went from teenage rebellion to something way darker. As rumors started to spread, people in Johnson began to hear about what was going on. They heard whispers of cemetery orgies, drugs, and drinking. The very few women in the group were not even allowed to wear robes. They had to wear black lingerie or be completely nude. It was all going as Mark had planned, until one night when someone suggested they kidnap and sacrifice an infant. That's when Mark finally thought, this has gone too far. He disbanded the group, but his interest in Satanism did not fade. Although he was alone, he continued his rituals on his own. After high school, he worked at a fast food joint, where he met brothers Keith and David Lawrence. Keith had picked up a fascination with Satanism after years of bullying and being sent off to boarding school. He was very, very intense into Satanism. Keith pulled his older brother David into it and even chased him around the house with a knife once to get him to pledge his loyalty to Satan. While David didn't get Keith's obsession, he went along with it just so that he could shut up his brother. Mark and Keith took everything about Satanism very seriously. They would study the heavy metal albums they owned for hours, reading the liner notes like Holy Scripture and absorbing every dark lyric. To them, the lyrics were not just for show. They saw them as messages to be interpreted and, if possible, acted on. When they weren't analyzing music, they were devouring any satanic book they could find to really connect on what Satan was asking them to practice. They would quickly flip through pages for new ways to connect with who they saw as a higher power, a higher, darker power. They wanted Satan to know that they were completely devoted to him. In their most intense move yet, Mark and Keith decided to write a formal contract with Satan. In this contract, they vowed to devote the next 20 years of their lives to the Dark Lord. They sealed the pact with an agreement that, after those 20 years, Satan could do with them as he pleased, whether that meant enslaving them or ending their lives. This wasn't a prank or a passing interest to them. They took the contract really seriously, marking a turning point that set them onto an even darker path. After signing, the three men quit their jobs to join a traveling carnival that rolled into town. This was new to Mark, but not new to David and Keith, as they had worked in carnival previously in the Bahamas before they met them at the fast food job. They were very familiar with the transient world of the carnival life. In the 1990s, carnivals were traveling all across the U.S., specifically in the smaller, more rural towns, and they were full of rides, games, food, vendors, performers, but they also developed a really kind of intense reputation. Carnies, as they were often called, were seen as outsiders and were usually people who wanted to be outside of the box. They weren't necessarily normal, and they did not want to be labeled as such. For Mark, immersing himself in any carny culture that he could was like stepping into an entirely new world. It was an environment where the abnormal was celebrated, and people like him and Keith could embrace that culture. It gave them a new level of intensity and freedom that seemed to kick their mutual feelings of Satanism into gear. The carnival that Mark and Lawrence brothers joined traveled all around Indiana, but this was its last stop before winter. The DeKalb County Fall Free Fair, which had been running for over 90 years. Mark met a ton of new people through this new job. In their small town, the satanic beliefs were often seen as strange or violent, but among the carnies, they realized that they weren't so unusual after all. Eventually, the group met another man named Jimmy Panic, who also shared the obsession with Satanism and satanic practices and rituals. The four of them would walk around the carnival, hoping to find others who shared their interests of Satanism, and asked if they wanted to join their newfound cult. They bonded with other carnival workers, swapping stories about the crimes they committed over the years. Most of the crimes were petty, like theft and vandalism. However, as they chatted, Mark and David learned that Jimmy had committed a serious crime just months earlier when he worked at a carnival in Ohio. Jimmy wanted to keep his dark past hidden, but the word started to spread through the carnival. Only a few people knew the full story. On August 30th, 1991, just a few months before joining the carnival, Jimmy had killed a fellow carny named Andrew Wright. Andrew had known about another crime that Jimmy committed, so to silence him, Jimmy murdered him, slitting his throat and dumping his body on the side of a turnpike. While most were horrified, Mark and David were intrigued, even respecting Jimmy for his more violent past. As the rumors spread, the men met a 21-year-old carny named William Anthony Alt, also known as Tony, born on July 2nd, 1970, in Rochester, Indiana. Tony was always an outsider. He developed an interest in Satanism in high school, but he never really fully committed like Mark and the Lawrence brothers had committed. He was kind of on the fence about it. After the men told Tony about their beliefs and rituals, Tony really wanted to join. He finally found people who knew and understood the feelings that he had had for so many years. At first, the group was reluctant to let him in. They thought he was nice, but they never really had a reason as to why they didn't want him to join their cult. However, Tony kept pushing to be involved and really wanted to join. Then, Tony realized he had something that could guarantee his entry into their little cult: the secret about Jimmy's murder. Since Jimmy had not been caught, Tony figured he could use this as blackmail. He threatened to go to the police until they let him join. Under pressure, Jimmy did agree to let Tony into the group, also known as a cult, and they finally told him that he'd be initiated in an upcoming ceremony. Tony didn't even blink twice as to why they changed their minds so quickly. He was just really excited they were going to let him in. On September 25th, 1991, Mark approached his girlfriend, Barbara Ferguson, asking her to help with the initiation. They needed her to find a secluded spot for the ritual, somewhere away from people who could possibly see or hear them. Mark also mentioned they wanted a good backdrop for a picture to commemorate Tony entering the cult. The next day, as the carnival wrapped up its last day of operation for the year, Brenda drove Mark, Keith, David, Jimmy, and Tony out to a secluded barn on Auburn Farms. After dropping them off, Mark told her to return in a few hours. Once alone, the group piled up dry wood and broken lumber for a bonfire. The group took off an old, rusty barn door to create a makeshift altar near the growing bonfire. They told Tony to lie down on the altar, telling him that this was the ritual for the initiation. They stated that this is what they all had done, and Tony had to do it too. Although Tony was hesitant, he really wanted to be a part of the cult, so he agreed. They bound his limbs with rope, ensuring that he would not escape. Then, Jimmy pulled out a knife, and as Tony struggled against the restraints, Jimmy made small cuts along his throat, careful not to kill him. He then traced the knife down to his chest and stomach, creating shallow wounds that caused a little bit of blood to come out. Tony tried to remain calm as they weren't stabbing him, but maybe it was just a little bit of blood that they needed for the ritual, the initiation. After all, they all had done it too, right? But after the long process, he told them he was uncomfortable with what was happening, and he demanded to be untied, but instead they gagged him. As they continued their twisted ritual, invoking Satan and chanting around the altar, they passed the bloody knife around, carving satanic symbols and inverted crosses into Tony's skin. By the end of the torture, Tony had several inverted crosses gouged into his chest. This, however, was only the beginning. The group was not finished. They sawed off both of Tony's ears, muffling his screams even more. Then Keith decided he wanted to try and remove Tony's heart while it was still beating. He cut into Tony's chest but quickly realized it was a difficult task. Keith realized he would have to break through the bone and sever arteries to do that, so he stopped. As Tony laid there, chest open, Jimmy leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Are you ready?" Jimmy pressed the knife against Tony's throat and cut deep into his neck. They watched as Tony's blood slowly poured out and he eventually lost his life. After he died, they dismembered his body, tossing his head and hands into the bonfires in hopes of destroying his evidence. Keith took Tony's head out of the fire once it was reduced to charred bone. He said that he would bury it, but eventually he came back later for it as a gift for someone. The group did rob Tony. They took his wallet and his belongings out before they burned the rest of his body. Eventually, Brenda returned with the van, completely unaware of the horrific act that had just taken place. As she pulled up, she noticed Tony was nowhere to be found, but she didn't ask any questions. They had some of his cash, so they all decided to celebrate by heading to a local Arby's to eat together. Isn't that so, genuinely messed up? After they finished eating, Jimmy decided to flee to his parents' house in Shelbyville, Indiana. Mark and the Lawrence brothers planned to head to Florida in search of work at another carnival. They took off in Mark's van, which they eerily nicknamed Rigor Mortis. And if you don't know what rigor mortis is, for anyone who doesn't really listen to true crime, it's basically the process that the body takes after you pass away that starts to stiffen up your body. So if you've ever watched true crime shows or any type of law enforcement shows where they're rigor mortis has already set in, it means that once that starts to set in, there's no coming back from that because the body is literally shutting down and stiffening up. Keith, David, and Mark eventually made it to Florida and found jobs at a new carnival. But by December, Mark could not take the guilt anymore. The entire state of Indiana was talking about Tony's disappearance, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he turned his back on his morals before he went into Satanism. He remembered that he left his initial group because they wanted to kidnap and sacrifice a baby, and he believed that that was too far. But he actually just ended up murdering a person. His guilt started to overpower him, and eventually, on December 12, 1991, he decided to come clean. He called his father, Keith Goodwin, back in Indiana and confessed everything to him. After hearing everything his son was telling him, Keith contacted the police. He told them that Mark had witnessed a murder during a satanic ritual sacrifice, not that he was involved, which technically, he did not kill him, but he was involved. He did not give the final blow. He just carved the little things into Tony's body. He wasn't actually the one who eventually killed him. Mark was arrested and brought back to Indiana. Along with him, the police also picked up Brenda to get her side of the story. During her interview, she admitted to taking them to the barn and picking them up afterward, but she claimed she had no idea what happened during their absence. Brenda identified the barn where the ritual had taken place, and when police searched the area, they discovered Tony's bones in the ashes of the bonfire. His remains did not burn in the ways that they had hoped, thankfully. Mark was eventually arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, admitting only to witnessing the crime and playing a minor role. Meanwhile, Jimmy was later arrested in Shelbyville, Indiana, and was charged with aggravated murder and quickly confessed to everything. The Lawrence brothers, on the other hand, had made it to the Bahamas, working at another carnival, but when they returned to Florida, customs agents recognized their names and detained them due to their outstanding warrants. They were brought back to Indiana to face charges for the murder of Tony. David Lawrence, the older brother, immediately pled guilty, showing signs of remorse. He claimed he hadn't committed the murder and dismissed Satanism, blaming everything on his younger brother Keith. He insisted that he only went along with it out of loyalty and had no intention of participating. He even said that if he hadn't been caught, he planned to cut ties with Keith for good. In April 1993, David's trial concluded, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. The judge noted that although David was the older brother, he had been manipulated by his younger brother Keith, and he believed that he could eventually be rehabilitated. Keith, on the other hand, had clearly participated in the ritual and was the one who tried to carve out Tony's heart. He had a long criminal history and was initially charged with murder, facing 80 years in prison. However, an agreement was reached with the prosecution, and his charges were reduced to conspiracy to commit murder to secure a conviction. The defense's strategy was to downplay Keith's connection to Satanism, arguing he wasn't a true Satanist, even though the case was about his violent crime in comparison to Satanism. This was the era of the Satanic Panic, and the defense tried to portray Keith as someone who was just seeking a new religion. He also studied various religions, including the Greek and Hebrew Bibles and the Quran. The prosecution, however, focused on the violent crime itself, not Keith's beliefs. I agree. You have to focus on what they did. Like, there's been many times that people have committed murder and they went to church and they claim to be Christian. If I were to go to trial, because I do believe in God, if I were to go in trial, would you focus on that I believed in God, or would you focus that I killed someone? I feel like you would kind of focus on that I killed someone. I do get that this was a different time. Testimonies revealed that while Keith had not delivered the final blow, he did help carve the inverted crosses into Tony's chest and attempted to remove his heart. Keith was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison, along with 20 years probation. During the trials, investigators noted that Mark and David appeared to be the only ones filled with remorse, but many people believed differently. Some believed they genuinely did feel sorry for what had happened, while others suspected it was merely an act to appease the court for lesser sentences. While awaiting trial, Mark and David went to a chaplain every day, praying and trying to show that they had reconnected with Christianity. Later during his trial, David expressed regret for what had happened, stating, "That boy Tony had the right to live." Mark, too, publicly apologized to Tony's mother, Shirley, saying he was ashamed of what he did, but she stated back to him, "You damn well should be. What chance does he have now? What, am I supposed to feel sorry for you? You never should have done it." Many viewed Mark's apology as a ploy to gain sympathy from the jury, not that he actually meant it. In the end, Mark was found guilty but only received an 8-year sentence. As for Jimmy Pinnock, it was determined that he delivered the fatal blow and was charged with the murder, facing the death penalty in Indiana. He also faced life in prison in Ohio for Andrew Wright's murder. And if you don't remember, Andrew Wright was the person that Jimmy had killed before he had met the Carny cult, the group. And that was the one that Tony was using as blackmail against him. So he had 2 murders under his belt. To avoid the death penalty, he pled guilty to the Ohio murder. Ultimately, Jimmy was sentenced to 60 years in Ohio and 20 years to life in Indiana. The judge called the murder as one of the most heinous crimes ever committed in DeKalb County. Mark and David have both served their 8-year sentences and are free today. Keith served 11 years of his 30-year sentence before he was released in 2004 for good behavior. While in prison, he took college courses, and because of his good behavior, He did not have any probation after being released. However, only 2 years later, in 2006, he was arrested again for public intoxication, battery, criminal confinement, and he had to go to jail for 180 days. Mark and the Lawrence brothers are all out of prison now, but in retrospect, some still blame this crime on Satanism and the dark underbelly of carnival culture. Others believe that even without the ritual, the murder would have taken place anyways. They argue the ceremony was merely an excuse to torture and kill Tony to silence him about Jimmy's previous crime. Which I believe. My whole stand, just picking up the whole microphone. Which I believe. I believe that. I sure do. This kind of reminds me of, I almost said Marilyn Manson. No, Charles Manson. This kind of reminds me of Charles Manson with his cult. People don't really believe that Charles Manson, like the Manson family, is a cult. I fully do. I believe anybody that gets together as a group with, like, under the pretense of a leader that is just, like, not fully there is very much a cult. Especially if you base it off of any type of religion, like any type. If you make up one, or if, like, because most cults are under the practice of a lot of Christian beliefs, believe it or not. I love cults. I love learning about them. Hold on, let me back up. I don't love cults. Whoa. I love learning about cults because I think I said this in my last episode. I did my, like, overall undergrad thesis, not technically a thesis, but I said this last time, of cults and how manipulative they can be. They prey the most on, like, really vulnerable people who are just, like, trying to fit into a community in some way. So that's why a lot of people, whenever they go and they join a cult, and you're just kind of like, I would never. You don't know that. You don't know that. This sounds crazy. This isn't what I'm trying to say, but whenever I was at my lowest point in my life, I found church and I went to church. Like, technically, obviously that's not like a cult, but I went to church at a very, very low point in my life. I was very vulnerable and I changed my life for the better. Some people, this does change for the worse. I don't think that it's fair to base the killing of Tony off of their beliefs at the time. Yes, this was around the time of the Satanic Panic, which is an episode that I do have, like, prepared. I have already done the research for it. I have, like, the next, like, 10 episodes, like, prepared. I do believe that this would have taken place if it wasn't for their satanic beliefs. I 100% agree. I think that is a cop-out. I feel like this would have happened without it. Jimmy literally was talking about killing someone over another crime that they were going to tell about. So this is maybe Jimmy coerced them into killing Tony so that way they could go on about their lives of satanic rituals. I do kind of believe with Mark and David, they didn't really want to be involved. I do think that it was mainly like Keith and Jimmy, because obviously, like the story says, but because there's not a lot of information about the story, I also, like, cannot form a super valid opinion. So I don't know. Let me know what y'all think about this. Let me know what y'all think about the Satanic Panic and cults in general. And, like, have y'all ever dabbled in any other type of religion to escape or find, like, that community? Let me know, because that's really interesting. I do want to say I've had a few people message me. I've had actually 2 new cases that people presented to me that they want me to talk about. I'm actually going to make those a priority and try and fit them in the next few episodes, so just be prepared for that. Thank you all for also suggesting cases. One of them I've never heard of, and I looked and not a single true crime YouTuber has covered this case. So I will be doing the case of that, and for the woman who reached out to me and was like, please, I'm going to have that as a priority for the next few episodes. As always, you guys, thank you so much for listening every single week. Thank you for the people who tune in. Again, I'm going to put up my subscriber count compared to my not subscribed count. Literally more, like 90% of the people who listen to me are not subscribed. Please hit the subscribe button. It really, really helps. I'm trying to hit at least 2,000 by the end of the year. Thank you guys so much for listening as always. Be sure to tune in next week. Again, I still do have affiliate codes with Movavi and NordVPN. If that is something you're interested in, please go check out the links down below. Thank you guys, as always, so much for listening and giving case suggestions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye!